Beautiful love, what have you done to me? I was contented till you came along. Feeding my soul with your song. Beautiful love, I love your paradise. Such a whole life. My dream to realize, reaching for heaven, depending on you. Beautiful love, where my dreams come true. Beautiful love, where my dreams come true. Beautiful love, where my dreams come true. Beautiful love.
이거 무리하게 안 된다.